Since the end of the war in 1953, the Korean Peninsula is divided by a frozen conflict that still awaits a definitive settlement. The recent developments as the signs of detente between North and South Korea, or the meeting between the former's leader Kim-jong-un and US President Donald Trump, have left people with some hope of a peaceful resolution of the Korean issue. But will it actually be the case? After having been under Japanese domination for nearly 4 decades, in 1945 Korea was divided in 2 occupation zones separated by the 38th parallel. The Soviet one to the north and the US-led Allied one in the south. While the original plan was to ultimately restore an independent and unified Korean state, in practice things unfolded differently. As the Cold War emerged, the disagreements between Moscow and Washington led to the establishment of 2 different states, a pro-communist one ruled by Kim Il-sung in the north, with Pyongyang as capital, and an authoritarian but pro-American one in the south, whose government was based in Seoul. The efforts to reach a common agreement over the reunification of the peninsula were all unproductive, and the situation stalled until 1950 when North Korea invaded the south. Exploiting the surprise effect, its troops captured Seoul and almost managed to occupy the whole peninsula. The international coalition, created to defend the south, patronized by the United Nations and headed by the US, struggled to stop the advancing enemy. But then the US organized a counter-offensive with a bold amphibious landing at Incheon. They cut the supply lines of the North's armies and pushed them back to the initial positions. Acting beyond the UN directive, the Allied forces proceeded further north, taking Pyongyang and almost reaching the Yalu River, Korea's border with China. Feeling threatened, the People's Republic of China intervened in support of its North Korean ally in December 1950. The coalition was expelled from the North's territory and the communist troops conquered Seoul a second time. But once again the US and its allies counterattacked and retook the city in March 1951. The situation stabilized along the 38th parallel, and no notable changes occurred until the signature of an armistice in 1953. While this practically put an end to the conflict, a true peace treaty was never signed, and as such the Korean War is officially still unresolved. Since then the situation has stalled. The South maintained an authoritarian regime for several decades before becoming a democracy in 1987, beginning a period of rapid economic growth that turned it into one of the world's most dynamic economies. The North, under the leadership of the Kim family, has remained a ruthless, isolationist, heavy militarized and economically fragile dictatorship centered upon the Jewish ideology, a peculiar combination of communism, nationalism, Korean tradition and cult for the ruler. As of today, the Korean Peninsula remains divided, and this deeply influences the foreign policy of the 2 Korean states and of the other powers implied in the area. First, since Korea is relatively small, both states are exposed to a potential attack coming from the other and its allies, notably as both capitals, and especially Seoul, are close to the border. This proximity curse is a central factor in the security dilemma that they face, which we will discuss later. Secondly, there are the political factors. South Korea is allied with the US, which maintains bases and troops on its territory and that has even the power to take command of the South Korean military in case of war. The 2 countries regularly hold joint maneuvers that anger the DPRK, who on its part is allied with China. The 2 states are tied by a 1961 treaty that establishes China as the security guarantor of the North. However, its commitment is not total, as it would intervene only if the DPRK were attacked, and not if it would launch an offence. In this regard, it is notable that amid the tensions between Washington and Pyongyang in 2017, the Chinese communicated that they would defend North Korea if the US attacked it. As a matter of fact, the Korean Peninsula holds a particular geostrategic significance for both China and America, especially now that they are engaged in a broader competition in the Asia Pacific and beyond. For China, North Korea is a buffer zone separating its territory from the US allied South, and therefore do not want the Pyongyang regime to collapse. This is why it keeps the 1961 treaty alive and continues supplying North Korea with essential goods without which its economy would collapse. But at the same time, the division of Korea is also a problem. The risk remains that a war involving the US may break out in China's backyard, in which case it would have to choose between seeing the American forces reaching the Yalu and creating a unified Korea under Washington's influence, or intervening and battle the US military to prevent this outcome. On its part, America is also facing a dilemma in Korea. Remaining committed to protecting the South is important to preserve the credibility of its security engagements and to maintain a useful military presence in the area. But at the same time, it also faces the risk of being involved in a conflict that may escalate to include China. Finally, there are two other powers that have some interests at stake in the peninsula. The first is Japan, who is equally concerned over the possibility of being directly or indirectly involved in a war, and who sees North Korea's missiles and nuclear program as a threat to its security. The second is Russia, who would not see favourably a further extension of America's influence in the region. In short, all the powers involved in the issue do not want a conflict, yet the risk of war remains real because the two Korean states and their allies are trapped into a complicated security dilemma. Both South Korea and North Korea continue to live as if the war could restart at any time. The two states maintain considerable military forces along the border, ready to respond in case of an attack, even though no party wants to launch an offensive. But the looming threat of an escalation, most likely during a crisis, remains sufficient to keep both in alert. As a matter of fact, the security dilemma is very strong here, also because of the aforementioned proximity curse. Most of North Korea's forces are concentrated along the frontier. In particular, it has amassed hundreds of artillery pieces, ready to unleash a rain of fire on the highly populated Seoul area, which would cause uncountable victims and terrible material damage, with huge repercussions on the financial economic plan as well. This is already a very powerful deterrent against any attack on the north by the South or its main ally, the US. But at the same time, it is the reason why South Korea wants to be ready for war and maintains its close alliance with the Americans. It considers this as the only way to dissuade the North from attempting to reunify the peninsula by force. But this and the US presence in South Korea in turn is what motivates Pyongyang to keep its armed forces ready for attack. The massive damage it could inflict on the South is an extremely effective means of dissuasion, probably equal and even superior to its nuclear weapons. This security dilemma is the main driver at the base of North Korea's quest for nuclear weapons, as from its perspective it is the only way it can ensure its security in a challenging geopolitical environment. During the Cold War, the South was still poor and military weak, and North Korea could benefit from the support of two powerful allies, namely China and the Soviet Union. Considering also that it had already had formidable conventional retaliation means, it felt safe enough not to need nuclear weapons to guarantee its safety. But the balance of power in the peninsula gradually changed with time as South Korea developed its economy and filled the military gap with its northern neighbour. In this context, in the late 80s, North Korea was first suspected of having a military nuclear program. Things turned more complicated for the North in 1991. The Soviet Union fell, and China, whose relations with the US had much improved, was just beginning its economic boom. So North Korea was left virtually alone to face the possibility of a conflict, and this reinforced its determination to obtain nuclear weapons. In practice, this choice just worsened the security dilemma, but in the optic of Pyongyang's regime, it was the only guarantee that no one would try to attack the country and topple its government. Moreover, it also gave North Korea a powerful tool to attract the world's attention and obtain much needed economic aid from the international community. As a matter of fact, an agreement with the US was initially reached in 1994, according to which Pyongyang pledged to stop its nuclear program in exchange of diplomatic recognition and economic assistance. At first the deal worked, but things changed once again in the early 2000s. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, US President George Bush pledged to counter weapons of mass destruction proliferation with all means and started implementing a preventive war doctrine to eliminate the quote-unquote axis of evil that threatened America. North Korea, who is explicitly included in the list and who is already suspected of running a clandestine nuclear program in spite of the pacts, felt menaced and decided to leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2003 and openly admit its quest for nuclear weapons. Being already engaged in Afghanistan and Iraq, Washington opted for diplomacy in the context of the six-party talks that included the two Korean states plus the US, China, Japan and Russia. In 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test, which showed that it had achieved its goal and therefore reinforced its position both strategically and diplomatically, as now the point was to disarm it rather than preventing proliferation. After long negotiations, North Korea accepted once again to end its nuclear program if it received economic aid, but no actual progress was made afterwards, and North Korea ultimately abandoned the SPT in 2009. Meanwhile, it continued making progress and testing nuclear warheads as well as ballistic missiles. When President Trump entered in office in 2017, he decided to apply a maximum pressure policy to push North Korea to dismantle its small but dangerous arsenal. After a crisis marked by verbal attacks and military shows of force, Trump and Kim Jong-un decided to talk directly. After meeting South Korean President Moon Jae-in, Kim went to Singapore in June 2018 to personally discuss with Trump, and negotiations have been underway since then. While the recent meetings were certainly historic events, the road ahead still appears to be long. North Korea has shown some goodwill, but the fundamental issues are still unresolved, and most importantly, the underlying geopolitical situation has not changed. Korea remains divided, the North's regime is still in power and wants to remain there, and there is no agreement of the future asset of the peninsula. Moreover, the current status quo is somehow convenient for everyone, as any alteration may result in less convenient outcomes and even an all-out war. Also, if the US used its military force to attack a foreign country and enforce regime change, North Korea would once again feel threatened and would probably decide to resume its nuclear program. Finally, apart from the geopolitics, the reunification of Korea would also imply a very high cost to develop the former North, and it seems no one really wants to sustain these expenses. Yet it cannot be excluded that progress will be made, that the nuclear issue will be solved and that Korea will eventually reunite. But in the short term, no breakthrough is likely to take place in the peninsula. Thanks for watching another KJ vid. We would like to especially thank our contributor Alex Guguridis, who conducted the research for this video in collaboration with KJ Vids. Please don't forget to support our crowdfunding campaign on fundmypage.com or join our Patreon program where you can get perks for our content. You can also browse our book collection on our website kjvids.co.uk. Finally, if you would like to sponsor a KJ video, you can do so via fundmyvideo.com. Thanks for watching again and see you next time.